The night was silent, broken only by the steady sound of tires on asphalt and the soft static of the radio. The road seemed empty. Like so many others, João had driven through during his long overnight hauls. But that night, something was about to break the monotony and change everything. Suddenly, emerging from the fog, João saw a cyclist staggering into the road. He eased on the brakes, trying to understand what he was seeing. The cyclist was injured, his face bruised and his eyes filled with panic. Behind him, a black car was approaching at high speed, headlights off, as if trying not to be noticed. João gripped the steering wheel tightly. His instincts told him something was very wrong. He didn't know the man, but the urgency in his eyes said enough. The radio crackled again. João took a deep breath. For a second, he hesitated. He thought about driving on. After all, the road was full of traps too. But something inside him shouted louder. The cyclist tried to cry for help, but his voice failed. The footsteps behind him were fast, determined. The black car stopped suddenly. Two armed men jumped out and began running toward the cyclist. João watched it all in seconds that felt like an eternity. He knew he wasn't a cop or a hero. He was just a truck driver trying to finish another delivery. But that night, on that deserted road, there was no one else to help. João shifted gears, stepped on the gas, and aimed the truck's headlights straight at the men. The horn echoed through the darkness. And that's where the real story begins. If that scene already grabbed your attention, just imagine what's coming next. Like the video now and subscribe to the channel, because stories like this deserve to be told. And at the end, I want to know, would you have the courage to stop? João was not a famous man, nor someone who sought attention. He was just one among countless anonymous truck drivers who crossed the country day and night, delivering food, medicine, and hope to the most remote places. Born in a small town in the countryside, he learned the value of hard work early on. The son of a mechanic and a school teacher, he grew up watching his father tune engines and his mother teach with patience. At 17, he left school for a job as a loading assistant. Little by little, he earned his employer's trust and, through his own effort, obtained his professional driver's license. Since then, he had spent more than 20 years on the road. João knew every curve, every steep climb, every gas station where he could safely rest before continuing his journey. The night was silent, broken only by the steady sound of tires on asphalt and the soft static of the radio. The road seemed empty. Like so many others João had driven through during his long overnight hauls. But that night, something was about to break the monotony and change everything. Suddenly, emerging from the fog, João saw a cyclist staggering into the road. He eased on the brakes, trying to understand what he was seeing. The cyclist was injured, his face bruised and his eyes filled with panic. Behind him, a black car was approaching at high speed, headlights off, as if trying not to be noticed. João gripped the steering wheel tightly. His instincts told him something was very wrong. He didn't know the man, but the urgency in his eyes said enough. The radio crackled again. João took a deep breath. For a second, he hesitated. He thought about driving on. After all, the road was full of traps too. But something inside him shouted louder. The cyclist tried to cry for help, but his voice failed. The footsteps behind him were fast, determined. The black car stopped suddenly. Two armed men jumped out and began running toward the cyclist. João watched it all in seconds that felt like an eternity. He knew he wasn't a cop or a hero. He was just a truck driver trying to finish another delivery. But that night on that deserted road, there was no one else to help. João shifted gears, stepped on the gas, and aimed the truck's headlights straight at the men. The horn echoed through the darkness. And that's where the real story begins. If that scene already grabbed your attention, just imagine what's coming next. Like the video now and subscribe to the channel, because stories like this deserve to be told. And at the end, I want to know, would you have the courage to stop? João was not a famous man, nor someone who sought attention. He was just one among countless anonymous truck drivers who crossed the country day and night, delivering food, medicine, and hope to the most remote places. Born in a small town in the countryside, he learned the value of hard work early on. The son of a mechanic and a school teacher, He grew up watching his father tune engines and his mother teach with patience. At 17, he left school for a job as a loading assistant. Little by little, he earned his employer's trust and, through his own effort, obtained his professional driver's license. Since then, he had spent more than 20 years on the road. João knew every curve, every steep climb, every gas station where he could safely rest before continuing his journey. He was the kind of man who valued routine. He liked to drive at night when traffic was calmer and the silence helped him think. He always kept a thermos of coffee in the console, listened to sertanejo music on the radio, and kept a picture of his family pinned to the truck's dashboard. He had been married to Helena for 15 years, and together they had 2 children. His greatest pride was being able to provide for them with dignity, even while enduring the loneliness and dangers of the road. That night, João was transporting supplies to a small village deep in the countryside. Nothing out of the ordinary, just another delivery like so many others. But he didn't know that, within a few hours, he would face the most important decision of his life. There was no training for what he was about to encounter. No manual teaches you how to act when you're alone, staring danger in the face. But it's precisely in those moments when no one is watching that true heroes reveal who they really are. The night crept on, and the road seemed endless. A blanket of clouds cast the landscape into heavy shadow, and a thin mist began to form over the asphalt. João had been driving for more than 5 hours, and the next stop was still dozens of kilometers away. Even though he was used to the solitude of the road, there was something about this night that left him uneasy. Then, as he took a wide curve, he spotted something strange on the shoulder. A faint flickering light swayed in the darkness, as if someone were trying to signal. He instinctively eased off the accelerator. As he drew closer, he could make out the silhouette of a fallen bicycle, and beside it, a man struggling to stay upright, arms raised. João's stomach tightened. Many truck drivers had fallen into traps like this before. Sometimes someone would pretend to be injured, and when the driver stopped, they'd be surrounded by criminals. It was impossible not to think about it. He scanned both sides of the road. Not a single other vehicle in sight. Everything was quiet, perhaps too quiet. The truck rolled closer, and João saw the cyclist's face. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead, and there were visible marks of assault on his arms. The man could barely speak, but with effort he managed to whisper, "They're still close." At that moment, the truck's headlights illuminated a black car parked a short distance ahead, partially hidden among bushes and shadows. Doors open, windows shattered. Something was definitely wrong. João narrowed his eyes, and for a moment he thought about driving on. It would be safer, but there was something in that desperate look that held him there. Something that wouldn't let him turn away. He felt that if he left this man behind, he'd never sleep peacefully again. Right then, hesitation gave way to resolve. He had to act, even afraid, even without knowing what he was stepping into. João kept the engine running, his eyes fixed on the dark car ahead. The cyclist, now leaning against the side of the truck, was trembling and trying to catch his breath. Between gasps, he managed to say, "They're armed. They took everything. I ran. But they're close." João's heart pounded. He looked again at the black vehicle. One of the rear doors was slightly open. The silence became unbearable. Every second felt stretched, like time itself was holding its breath. Then a shadow moved. 2 figures emerged from the roadside brush, slowly, cautiously, as if stalking prey. One of them pointed something in João's direction. He couldn't tell if it was a gun, but the message was clear. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a simple robbery gone wrong. This was a calculated, dangerous situation. João had stumbled into something serious, and now he had to choose between fleeing or confronting it. He felt the weight of that choice. Turning away would mean safety, but at what cost? Leaving the cyclist behind didn't feel like an option anymore. Not after looking into his eyes and seeing pure desperation. João took a deep breath and locked the truck doors from the inside. He reached for the CB radio and quickly sent out a distress signal, hoping that someone on the same channel would pick it up. He spoke calmly but firmly, reporting the location and the presence of armed suspects. Outside, the two figures were now moving faster. One approached the cyclist, while the other began circling the truck, looking for a blind spot. João turned the wheel slightly, positioning the truck between the cyclist and the attackers. In that moment, he wasn't thinking about heroism. He wasn't thinking about what the police would say or what the news might report. He was thinking like a father, like someone who knew what it meant to protect. The tension was now unbearable, but João had made his choice, and he wasn't going to back down. João knew he had only seconds to act. The attackers were closing in fast. The cyclist had collapsed behind the front wheel of the truck, barely conscious, while one of the men started shouting something João couldn't quite understand. The words were aggressive, laced with threats. The other circled the truck, looking for a way in, tapping the side of the cabin with what looked like the barrel of a weapon. João's hands were trembling, but his mind was clear. He shifted gears. The truck roared in response. With a sharp turn of the steering wheel, he swung the massive vehicle to block the entire width of the road. The headlights hit the two men directly, blinding them for a moment. Then he pressed the horn, long, loud and piercing, echoing through the night like a battle cry. Startled, one of the attackers fired a shot into the air, but stumbled backward on the gravel. The second hesitated, looking around, uncertain if more people were approaching. That hesitation was all João needed. He threw open the driver's door and jumped down, gripping a heavy iron tool he kept for tire repairs. He didn't plan to fight, unless forced, but he made sure the attackers saw he wasn't defenseless. His silhouette, backlit by the truck's high beams, looked larger and more imposing than he really was. Holding his ground, João shouted to the cyclist to stay down and keep still. Then he turned toward the attackers. "You've got two choices," he called out firmly. "Leave now or wait for the police." The men looked at each other, clearly caught off guard. João had shifted the balance. What seemed like an easy ambush had turned into a high-risk situation. And behind him, the sound of a distant engine approached. Reinforcements? They didn't know. But João did. He had done his part. He had bought time. He had created a barrier between the innocent and the violent. On that dark, isolated road, a truck driver had made a stand. And in that moment, courage wasn't loud, it was steady, it was decisive, it was João. The air was heavy, thick with tension. João remained by the front of the truck, his body still, his eyes locked on the two assailants. For a moment, no one moved. The attackers stood in silence, as if weighing their next move. João gripped the iron bar in his hand tighter, his knuckles white. He didn't want violence, but he was ready for it if that was the only way to protect the man lying unconscious behind his truck. And then, in the distance, the faint sound of an engine began to rise. At first it was barely noticeable, just a low hum that blended into the night. But within seconds it became clearer, louder, and unmistakable. Headlights appeared on the horizon, cutting through the fog like a beacon. Another truck. João felt a surge of relief mixed with adrenaline. The attackers turned their heads, startled. The second truck slowed down as it approached the scene, its driver clearly alerted by João's earlier radio call. The vehicle stopped just behind João's truck, boxing in the narrow road. The two assailants were now trapped between massive steel machines, with no easy exit. The new driver stepped out cautiously, a tall man in a reflective jacket, holding a flashlight in one hand and a tire iron in the other. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at João, who gave him a slight nod. That was enough. In the silence of the night, there was unity, an unspoken pact between men of the road. One protects, the other reinforces. No one gets left behind. Feeling the pressure closing in, the attackers began to back away, step by step. But it was too late. Just as they reached the edge of the brush, flashing red and blue lights illuminated the scene from the opposite direction. Police cars arrived in force, sirens off, lights rotating silently. Officers jumped out, weapons drawn, shouting commands. The two men dropped their weapons almost immediately and fell to the ground, knowing resistance was pointless. Within minutes, they were in handcuffs, seated against the police vehicles. Officers checked the scene, questioned João and the other trucker briefly, then rushed to assist the injured cyclist, who was now regaining consciousness. As paramedics arrived, João finally allowed himself to exhale. His body ached from the tension, his hands were still shaking, but inside, a deep sense of peace began to take hold. He hadn't just witnessed a tragedy, he had stopped it. More people began to arrive, residents from a nearby rural community who had seen the lights and heard the horn echoing through the night. Some brought blankets, others offered water. A small crowd formed, not out of curiosity, but out of solidarity. There was a quiet admiration in the way they looked at João. They understood what he had done. The officers, after assessing the situation, approached him. "If you hadn't intervened," one of them said, "this would have ended very differently. You probably saved that young man's life tonight." João nodded, humbled, but didn't say much. He didn't see himself as a hero. He was just someone who chose to do the right thing when it mattered. And in that, he found something far mayer than recognition. He found purpose. The chaos had passed. The sirens were gone. The night slowly began to return to its usual quiet rhythm. But for João, that stretch of road would never be the same again. After giving his final statement to the officers and ensuring the young cyclist was stable in the ambulance, João sat on the edge of his truck's step, elbows on his knees, breathing slowly. His heart still carried the weight of the adrenaline, but it was slowly giving way to something deeper, a quiet sense of peace. The cyclist, now conscious and receiving treatment, asked one of the paramedics to speak to João. With help, he approached the truck, bandages on his arms and a blanket over his shoulders. His voice was hoarse, but his words were clear. "You didn't have to stop," he said. "Most wouldn't have, but you did. I owe you my life." João looked at him for a moment, then he gave a simple nod. "No one deserves to die alone on the side of the road." The young man smiled weakly, tears welling in his eyes, and returned to the ambulance. That moment, raw, quiet, and human, stayed with João more than anything else that night. Later, back at the gas station where he always stopped after deliveries, the story had already spread. Truckers talked about it over coffee and pão de queijo. Frentistas greeted him with claps on the back. Even the old man who sold empadas by the door looked at him differently. One of them, a mechanic named Zeca, said something that stuck. "From today on, we don't call you João anymore. You're the road angel now." João laughed at first, brushing it off, but inside it moved him. He never chased fame. He didn't act to be remembered. But the recognition wasn't about ego. It was about knowing that what he did mattered, that he had made a difference. The days passed, and news of the incident reached local radio stations. A segment aired telling the story of the unknown trucker who saved a man from certain death. Messages from strangers poured in, thanking him. Some called him a hero, others said he gave them hope. And yet, João remained the same. He continued his deliveries, checked his tires before every trip, and kept that photo of his family on the dashboard. But now, every time he passed that stretch of road, he slowed down just a little. Not out of fear, but in remembrance. He knew that heroism doesn't always wear a uniform or carry a badge. Sometimes it wears a flannel shirt, holds a coffee-stained steering wheel, and chooses courage in the quiet moments no one else sees. And for the man whose life he saved, that choice meant everything. That night could have ended in tragedy. A young man could have lost his life. A family could have received devastating news. But none of that happened because one person made a choice. A truck driver, alone on a dark road, chose to act when it would have been easier to ignore. João didn't have special training. He wasn't carrying a weapon. He didn't know what would happen. All he had was instinct, courage, and the belief that doing the right thing matters, even when no one is watching. And maybe that's the real lesson. Every day, we pass by people who are struggling, people asking for help without saying a word. And like João, we are faced with a decision. Do we look away, or do we lean in? In a world where so many turn their backs, João showed us what it means to stand up, not with grand speeches, not with glory, but with action, quiet, firm, and brave. He reminds us that heroism isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up. It's about that one moment when fear meets purpose. And now, I want to ask you something. If you had been in João's place, would you have stopped? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear your honest opinion, because stories like this aren't just meant to be watched. They're meant to spark conversations. And if this story moved you even a little, like this video, it helps more people find these real stories. And if you're not subscribed yet, this is your moment. Because next time, we'll tell you the story of a little girl found crying on the roadside at night and the truck driver who uncovered the secret behind her disappearance. Trust me, you don't want to miss it. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and join us on the road where real heroes drive in silence and make history without even meaning to.